On August 20th, 1966, a teenage boy named Jorge da Costa Alves was flying a kite on a hilltop in the Niterói district of Brazil when he noticed two men lying motionless in the tall grass. They were side by side, dressed in formal suits, each wearing a crude mask fashioned from lead that covered their eyes. Beside them sat a small notebook containing handwritten instructions that, to this day, no one has been able to fully decipher or explain. Jorge ran home and told his grandmother, but the rough terrain and fading daylight delayed a proper response. It was not until the following day that police finally reached the bodies and began to grasp the strangeness of what they were dealing with. The men were Manoel Pereira de Cruz, 32 years old, and Miguel José Viana, 34. Both were electronic technicians from the town of Campos dos Goytacazes, about 170 miles northeast of Rio de Janeiro. They were not strangers. They were not enemies. They were friends and colleagues who had worked together repairing televisions and radios, a skilled trade in a country where consumer electronics were expensive and technicians were in high demand. They had left Campos together on August 17th, telling their families they were heading to the coastal city of Niterói to buy electronic components and materials for their work.
It seemed like a routine trip.
Nobody at home had any reason to worry. Their wives expected them back by dinner. 3 days later, their bodies were found on Vintem Hill, known locally as Morro do Vintem, a grassy slope overlooking the city that rises roughly 1,000 feet above the surrounding neighborhoods. There were no signs of struggle, no torn clothing, no defensive wounds. Just two men in suits, lying on their backs, as if they had simply decided to lie down and never get up. You're watching Mind Blown, where we uncover the stories that defy explanation. Here is where the details start to feel wrong. The lead masks were not professional equipment. They were simple, oval-shaped pieces of lead with eye holes cut out, the kind of thing someone could shape in a home workshop using basic metalworking tools that both men would have had access to through their trade. Lead is commonly used to block radiation, which is why dentists drape lead aprons over patients before taking x-rays. It is heavy, malleable, and effective at absorbing electromagnetic energy. Why would two electronics technicians craft crude lead-eye masks and bring them to a hilltop? That question has haunted investigators for almost 60 years. But the masks were not even the strangest part. Tucked near the bodies was a small notebook. Inside were handwritten instructions. The text, translated from Portuguese, read something close to this: 1630, be at the agreed place. 1830, swallow capsules. After the effect, protect metals. Wait for the mask sign. Those words suggest a sequence, a ritual of some kind. Swallow capsules. Protect metals. Wait for a signal. Someone, or something, was supposed to arrive. The phrase protect metals has particularly baffled researchers because it is unclear whether it referred to the lead masks themselves, to electronic equipment the men may have carried, or to something else entirely that was never recovered from the scene. Police retraced the men's final hours with painstaking effort. On the afternoon of August 17th, Manoel and Miguel arrived in Niterói by bus. They visited a small shop and purchased a bottle of distilled water and 2 raincoats, which is odd because the weather that day was clear and no rain had been forecast. Distilled water is notable because it has no minerals or impurities, making it useful in electronics work, but also in certain chemical preparations. A waitress at a bar near the base of the hill later told investigators she had served one of the men water. She recalled that one of them appeared nervous and kept checking his watch, as though operating on a strict timetable that could not be missed. That was one of the last confirmed sightings of either man alive. Witnesses in the area reported no screams, no unusual sounds, no signs of disturbance that evening. At some point after dark, they climbed Vintem Hill together. What happened next remains unknown. The hill had no lighting, no established trail to its summit, and no reason for 2 out-of-town visitors to be there unless they had chosen it in advance for a specific purpose. The autopsies were delayed for reasons that still frustrate anyone who studies the case. Brazil's forensic infrastructure in 1966 was limited, particularly outside of major hospitals in São Paulo and Rio de Janeiro. The tropical heat accelerated decomposition rapidly, and by the time pathologists examined the bodies, the internal organs had degraded too badly for a reliable toxicology report. That means no one was ever able to determine what the capsules mentioned in the notebook actually were. Were they poison? A hallucinogen like mescaline or a derivative of DMT, substances that were circulating in South American spiritual communities at the time? Some kind of homemade compound the men believed would open their minds to contact?
The physical cause of death was never officially established.
No trauma was found. No bullet wounds. No stab marks. No evidence of strangulation.
That single gap in the evidence has allowed dozens of theories to survive for decades. Because without a cause of death, nothing can be ruled out and nothing can be confirmed.
Investigators soon discovered that Manoel and Miguel shared an unusual and deeply held interest. Friends and family described both men as devoted to what was called scientific spiritualism, a fringe belief system popular in parts of Brazil during the 1960s that blended ideas from spiritism, UFO contact theories, and amateur electronics experiments. Brazil had a thriving spiritist tradition rooted in the teachings of Allan Kardec, a 19th-century French philosopher whose ideas about communication with the dead took hold across South America in ways they never did in Europe. The men reportedly believed that certain frequencies or devices could facilitate communication with extraterrestrial or spiritual beings, and that electronics could serve as a bridge between the physical and metaphysical worlds. Neighbors in Campos told police that Manoel and Miguel had been experimenting with homemade electronics in a small workshop, building devices whose purpose they did not share with anyone outside their circle. One account suggested the men had attempted a similar hilltop experiment before, traveling to an elevated location with equipment and masks, though details about that earlier attempt remain thin and unverified. If true, it means the night on Vintem Hill was not their first try. It was a repeat of something they had done before and survived. What deepens the unease is a detail from 4 years earlier. In 1962, an electrician named Hermes was found dead in the nearby municipality of São José de Meriti, also with a crude lead mask near his body. The parallels are difficult to ignore. Same type of victim, a man working with electronics and familiar with conductive materials.
Same bizarre lead eye covering. Same absence of obvious cause of death.
Whether there was any direct connection between Hermes and the two men from Campos has never been established. The communities were close enough geographically that overlapping social circles are plausible, especially within the small world of electronics repair and spiritist experimentation, but no investigator ever drew a confirmed link. Still, the coincidence has fueled speculation that a small, loosely organized network of people in the greater Rio de Janeiro area were conducting these experiments on hilltops and elevated terrain, believing that altitude brought them closer to whatever signal or presence they were trying to reach, and that the results were sometimes fatal. The Brazilian press at the time ran wild with the story.
Newspapers called it the case of the lead masks, and it became one of the most famous unsolved deaths in the country's history, generating the kind of national fascination that the Dyatlov Pass incident would later produce in Russia.
UFO researchers seized on the notebook's instructions as evidence that Manoel and Miguel were attempting to make contact with something not of this world, pointing out that the 1960s saw a surge of UFO sightings across South America, with Brazil being one of the most active hotspots on the continent. Skeptics proposed a simpler explanation. The men ingested a toxic substance, possibly as part of a misguided spiritual ritual, and simply died from poisoning before anyone could find them. The lead masks, under this theory, were a kind of ceremonial prop, something the men believed would protect them during their experience, not unlike a blindfold worn during a meditation exercise. A third theory suggested the men were murdered, perhaps by someone who had sold them a fraudulent spiritual experience and provided them with lethal capsules, but no suspect was ever identified. Neither explanation has ever been confirmed because the physical evidence that could settle the question rotted away in the Brazilian heat before anyone thought to test it. There is a detail people tend to overlook. The notebook did not just contain the instructions for that evening. It also contained references to prior meetings and plans, dates and times that corresponded to earlier gatherings, suggesting that whatever Manoel and Miguel were doing on Vintem Hill was not spontaneous. They had been preparing for weeks, possibly months. They had a timeline. They had a protocol. They had purchased specific supplies. That level of planning makes the theory of simple recreational drug experimentation harder to accept. People who accidentally poison themselves do not usually write out step-by-step schedules in advance, buy distilled water and raincoats for a clear evening, and travel 170 miles to carry out the plan on a specific hilltop at a specific hour. Something about that location mattered to them. Vintem Hill offers a wide, unobstructed view of the sky, which may have been the entire point. Something about that evening mattered. They chose it deliberately, and they followed their own written instructions right up until the moment they stopped being alive. What unsettles me most is the instruction to wait for a sign. Swallow the capsules, protect the metals, then wait. That implies they expected a response. They expected something to happen after they followed the steps. Whether that something was a hallucination triggered by whatever they swallowed, or a genuine belief that an intelligence would appear above them in the night sky, or something else entirely, we do not know. But they were not acting out of despair. There were no suicide notes. There were no reports of depression or financial trouble. They were acting out of expectation, even excitement.
These were two men who climbed a hill believing they were about to witness something extraordinary, something their years of experiments and meetings had been building toward.
And then they died, side by side, with lead over their eyes. Whatever they were waiting for, we have no way of knowing whether it came. The case was never closed in any satisfying way. No arrests were made. No substance was identified.
No third party was ever found or even seriously suspected.
In 2006, Brazilian journalist and UFO researcher Jacques Vallée revisited the case in his writings and noted that the lead masks bore resemblance to protective gear one might improvise against bright light or radiation, raising the question of what the men thought they were about to be exposed to.
Vallée, who had served as a consultant on Steven Spielberg's Close Encounters of the Third Kind, treated the case with more rigor than most UFO enthusiasts, acknowledging that the evidence supported multiple interpretations and that certainty was impossible. Their families never received answers. The widows of both men lived the rest of their lives without knowing what had taken their husbands from them. The town of Campos moved on, but Vintem Hill still sits there, overlooking Niterói, quiet and ordinary-looking, visited occasionally by curious tourists and researchers who stand on the same grass where two men in suits once lay, as if nothing ever happened on its slope. Two men left home to buy electronic parts. They ended up dead on a hill with lead masks over their eyes and a notebook full of instructions meant for a meeting that, as far as anyone can tell, only they attended. 60 years later, no one knows what they swallowed, no one knows what they expected to see, and no one knows why they died. If you had found that notebook, what would you believe the instructions meant? Tell me in the comments, because I genuinely do not have an answer for this one. Subscribe to Mind Blown. Next video, the deep sea recording no one has ever explained.